Once again at Brazil's helm, President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva quickly signaled a tougher stance toward Washington compared to his pro-U.S. predecessor, Jair Bolsonaro. One of his administration's first moves was to reinstate visa requirements for Americans, Canadians, and Australians visiting Brazil, ending the visa-free entry that Bolsonaro had unilaterally granted those countries. The move is a perfect example of one of Lula's biggest weaknesses. Some of his policies are highly ideological and tend to lack pragmatism. Lula's government announced in March 2023 that it was suspending the visa waiver because it violated Brazil's principle of reciprocity, since Brazilians still needed visas to enter those countries. In essence, Lula was saying that the U.S. would no longer get special treatment unless it treated Brazilians equally. Due to a significant gap in standards of living between Brazil and the targeted countries, it's understandable that those countries may want to place visa restrictions to enter their territories. The average citizen of the United States is 4 times richer than the average Brazilian. Thus, there is an incentive for a Brazilian citizen to enter the U.S. as a tourist, to then stay for economic reasons. There are other countries in the region which have entered the visa waiver program based on having attained higher economic and social indicators, namely Chile and Uruguay. The imposition of visas limited Brazil's tourism sector, costing the country jobs and investment. Brazil's Senate approved a bill early in 2025 to keep the visa exemptions, but the mood changed in the lower house after Trump imposed a 10% tariff on Brazilian goods. In his 2023 term, Lula has also resumed his Global South activism, often in ways that put him at odds with U.S. positions. Similarly, he has deepened Brazil's engagement with China, visiting Beijing in 2023 and openly questioning the dominance of the U.S. dollar in global trade. Lula exclaimed the following in an April 2023 speech in Shanghai, quote, "Every night I ask myself why all countries have to base their trade on the dollar. Why can't we trade based on our own currencies? Who decided that the dollar was the world's currency?" Unquote. He called on BRICS nations to develop an alternative currency for commerce, reflecting his continued quest to challenge U.S. financial hegemony. Luiz Inácio da Silva, Lula, rose from a humble background to become a prominent union leader and leftist politician in Brazil. He came of age during Brazil's military dictatorship, a regime that seized power with explicit support from the U.S. government amid Cold War fears of communism. This context deeply shaped Lula's worldview. As a young labor organizer in the 1970s, Lula witnessed what he interpreted as foreign-backed authoritarianism suppressing leftist movements in Latin America. The Brazilian left, including Lula's circle, viewed U.S. intervention with suspicion, seeing Washington's hand in the region's coups and dictatorships. In 1980, Lula co-founded the Workers' Party, PT, which held socialist ideals. This ideological grounding meant Lula was predisposed to distrust U.S. foreign policy, which he associated with supporting past dictatorships and undermining Latin American sovereignty. Lula's early political education was infused with leftist ideas common in Latin America's Cold War-era opposition movements. He admired leaders such as Fidel Castro and aligned himself with causes opposed by the U.S., such as the Palestinian struggle. As a union leader in the 1980s, Lula even established ties with the PLO. When Lula assumed the presidency in January 2003, the global and regional order was dominated by U.S. power. From the outset, Lula signaled that Brazil would pursue an independent course. Key foreign policy moves during Lula's first 2 terms often ran counter to U.S. interests, reflecting both ideological differences and Brazil's ambition to assert itself on the world stage. Lula's government frequently challenged U.S. policies on trade, war, and regional affairs, while promoting what he called Global South solidarity. One of Lula's earliest breaks with Washington came over the 2003 U.S.-led invasion of Iraq. Lula strongly opposed the invasion, criticizing the Bush administration for bypassing the United Nations. In August 2003, after a Brazilian UN diplomat was killed in Baghdad, Lula castigated the U.S. for undermining the UN's authority in Iraq. Lula declared the following, quote, "The behavior of the United States in relation to Iraq has weakened the United Nations," unquote. Throughout his presidency, Lula refused to endorse U.S.-backed efforts at regime change or isolation in the Western Hemisphere. For example, when Venezuela under President Hugo Chavez faced U.S. criticism and even a brief coup attempt in 2002, Lula opposed the United States' stance. While Washington often saw Chavez's leftist government as a threat, Lula treated Venezuela as a legitimate partner, opposing any U.S. effort to isolate it. Many now believe that Lula is partly responsible for Venezuela's descent into social and economic hell. He also pushed back against U.S. economic initiatives that he felt disadvantaged Brazil and its neighbors. A prime example was his staunch opposition to the proposed Free Trade Area of the Americas, FTA, a U.S.-led plan to create a hemisphere-wide free trade zone. As an opposition leader campaigning in 2002, he openly denounced the FTA as a form of American neo-imperialism. He went as far as saying that the FTA wasn't really a free trade pact, but a policy of annexation of Latin America by the United States. After becoming president, Lula followed through on this skepticism. His administration refused to sign on to the FTA unless it was radically revised to protect Brazilian interests. In practice, Brazil, along with Argentina and others, stalled and eventually derailed the FTA negotiations. At the 2005 Summit of the Americas in Mar del Plata, he joined a coalition of Latin American leaders who blocked the U.S. proposal, effectively killing the FTA initiative. Lula's government then proceeded to lead a group of developing countries to demand an end to rich country agricultural subsidies, saying that it hurt farmers in Brazil and elsewhere. In 2003, during WTO talks in Cancun, Brazil helped form the G20 coalition of developing nations, uniting Brazil, India, China, and others to successfully oppose a draft that was endorsed by the U.S. and the EU. Lula later pointed with pride to trade disputes Brazil won against the U.S., such as cases on cotton and sugar subsidies, touting them as proof that standing up to the U.S. could yield tangible benefits. Another area of divergence was financial governance and the response to the 2008 global financial crisis, which he publicly blamed on irresponsible behavior in wealthy countries. In an infamous remark in 2009, he stated that the crisis was caused by white men with blue eyes, a not-so-subtle reference to Western bankers, who he said had behaved as if they knew everything about economics. He demanded reforms to global financial institutions to give more weight to emerging economies, aligning with other world leaders from developing countries. Brazil thus joined calls to reform the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, seeking greater voting power for countries like Brazil and China, and less control for the United States and the European Union. Beyond Latin America, on his second day in office in 2003, his team conceived the idea for a trilateral forum uniting three notable nations of the developing world: India, Brazil, and South Africa. This was soon followed by an even more ambitious coalition, the BRICS grouping of large emerging economies: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Lula was an enthusiastic proponent of BRIC cooperation as a counterweight to the G7 club of Western powers. In 2009, Lula attended the inaugural BRICS summit in Yekaterinburg, and in 2010 he hosted the second BRICS summit in Brasilia. After leaving office in 2010, his distrust of U.S. intentions did not dissipate. By the time he returned to the presidency in January 2023, the global context had changed, but Lula's core foreign policy instincts remained familiar. President Trump didn't just declare trade war on China, but on the rest of the world. Anti-U.S. leaders in the region saw this as the opportunity of a lifetime. The U.S.-China trade tensions, especially the tariffs on American agricultural products, prompted China to seek alternative suppliers. Brazil capitalized on this opportunity, becoming a leading exporter of soybeans and other agricultural commodities to China. In 2025, China's state-owned food company, COFCO International, expanded its operations in Brazil by hiring extensively and constructing its largest export port terminal in Santos. Beyond agriculture, Brazil and China have strengthened ties in various sectors. Chinese investments in Brazil's metal industry have surged, with over $840 million invested in under 6 months, including the acquisition of the tobacco mine for $340 million. The imposition of U.S. tariffs under President Trump has inadvertently accelerated the strengthening of Brazil-China relations. Through expanded trade, diversified investments, financial cooperation, and high-level diplomacy, Brazil has solidified its partnership with China, positioning itself as a pivotal player in the evolving global economic landscape. This is Latinometry. Subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss any other interesting videos about Latin America and the world. Please like and share this video, and thanks for watching.